nothing about them. Clearly, food is critical, we know that now, but toxins are still ignored. What about the role of all the neurotoxins that are in our environment that we're exposed to through our food, through the air, through water, through household cleaning products, through cosmetics, literally everywhere? And I think we know that certain toxins are very neurotoxins, like heavy metals, like mercury and lead. We know, for example, that the average newborn baby in their umbilical cord blood, before they take their first breath, has 287 known toxins. And this study was done over 10 years ago when they couldn't even measure all the toxins. So maybe there's more, and that 210 of those toxins were neurotoxic. Things like phthalates and PCBs and dioxin and flame retardants and pesticides and heavy metals and mercury and lead floating around in the baby's blood even before they took their first breath. So what about the rest of us that have been out in this sea of toxins for 30 or 40 or 50 years? Clearly these play a role, and they're synergistic, and they are clearly damaging our brains.
When it comes to environmental toxins, things like bisphenol A or heavy metals, mercury, lead is what comes to mind. Unfortunately, conventional physicians are less likely to look at these things and to even consider them as they hear about your symptoms and hear about what's going on with you. I wasn't trained to look at them when I went through Harvard Medical School and residency training at the University of California, San Francisco, so I had to learn it on my own. But once I started to test myself and then my patients, I was amazed at how many symptoms could then map onto environmental toxic load. So I'll give you an example. When it comes to environmental toxins, in some ways I don't think there is any place that we're not exposed to them. So we get it from the food that we eat. An example is being exposed to glyphosate. We get it from the air that we breathe. We know that pollution is a major cause of things like stroke and other brain problems. We know that we get exposed through skin products that we use, which is especially important to me because your skin can readily absorb environmental toxins, things like xenoestrogens, which are fake estrogens. I think of them like party crashers, meaning that they come into the human body and they stimulate your estrogen receptors and they basically just wreak havoc.
There are factors in our environment that have changed over the last 50 years that significantly affect the brain more than any other organ. Why? The brain is the most active organ in the body. This little 3-pound organ, which is 2% of body's weight, consumes 25% of body's energy. So anything that's using its energy to that extent will also be overwhelmed by toxins and environmental factors that can significantly damage it. But first and foremost, we don't have to focus on that. We have plenty of toxins in our environment, such as the foods that we're eating, all the factors that we've added to the foods, and other factors that over time just start chipping away at this reserve of the brain until you first see the manifestations in your 80s or 90s, or actually earlier. But the damage has started much earlier, in your 30s for that matter. So that's why we're talking about prevention much earlier than, waiting till you're 80 or 90.
Environmental toxins appear to be almost everywhere in our modern world, and the evidence suggests that they may well be linked to an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Let's explore this important connection. With so many toxins around, it can be hard to know exactly what to look out for. But two of the main toxins to really try to avoid are glyphosate and artificial sweeteners. These two offenders are specifically problematic because they disrupt the microbiome, which then affects the levels of inflammation in our body and our metabolism as well. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, increased inflammation is directly linked to compromised brain health. Glyphosate has become an incredibly popular chemical in the agricultural industry, and this is the active ingredient in things like Roundup. What makes glyphosate so concerning is that it seems to have a toxic effect on the microbiome. And this has been demonstrated in multiple animal studies. Remember, the microbiome is the collection of microbes and their genetic material, as well as their metabolic products found within the gut. The microbiome is powerfully influential in terms of maintaining our metabolism, our neurotransmitters, and even our hormonal balance, in addition to its key role as the gatekeeper of inflammation in the human body. This is a major reason why glyphosate should be avoided. But to add to the picture, Glyphosate has been shown to be linked to an increased risk of developing cancer.
The importance of organic food has to do with the chemicals that are found in food that is not organic. And these days, the chemical that contaminates so many foods that are not organic in origin is glyphosate or Roundup. The use of glyphosate is related to the development of genetically modified food, GMO food. The problem with GMO food is not that it's genetically modified. That could be good, that could be bad. It's the reason that food is genetically modified. It's modified to make it resistant to glyphosate. Consequently, on a large industrial farm, you can aerial spray all of the crops with glyphosate, kill the weeds. You don't need to have people down there removing weeds, and the plant is not killed by the glyphosate. The problem is that now this food is contaminated with glyphosate, and glyphosate creates problems for the bacteria in your gut. And those problems may have long-reaching effects on your metabolism. Toxic substances from the environment may impact the growth of bacteria in your microbiome. The microbiome also processes these toxins and may make the toxins more or less dangerous to you depending upon what the toxin is and what the microbes in your microbiome are. It's a very complicated area, but a very important one.
We have to be very aware of this in our diets and try to reduce the consumption of GMO foods, not necessarily because of the GMO, but because of the glyphosate, which is one of the biggest problems with GMO. And we now are able to test in your urine how much glyphosate is there. I recently tested my glyphosate levels as I was curious, thinking that I eat more organic diet, that I eat grass-fed meats, that I try to be really diligent about not consuming any GMO foods. When I travel, I go out, I can't help it. And I found fairly significant levels of glyphosate in my urine, even though I consider myself at very low risk for glyphosate toxicity. So I think we all have to be aware that this is an issue, that it's in all of us, and that we can reduce our exposures, which also may have downstream benefits.
Toxins is a popular word in I would say in the functional medicine area and with the lay public. People list all kinds of toxins that we're exposed to. There's fine particles, for example, that we all are exposed to living in cities. I think the one toxin that has probably received most attention is glyphosate from Roundup, from the pesticides that are being used increasingly with GMO in the production of GMO-produced food. So this makes a lot of sense to me that glyphosate by itself was tested originally by the FDA in short-term experiments in a test tube, no long-term consequences. So we don't really know what the consequences are on a human organism when it's processed by the microbiota. So the microbiota have an ability to handle substances, so-called xenobiotics, that they've never seen in evolution, any chemical substance, in a way that they break it down and either make it less toxic or potentially more toxic on the host.
Another way in which our environment may be affecting our brains is through the effects of air pollution. Air pollution has been linked to a variety of negative health effects, but researchers now indicate that it may indeed produce direct effects detrimental to the brain. For example, a 2012 study showed that older women exposed to higher levels of air pollution experienced cognitive decline equivalent to 2 years of aging. In addition, another study showed that older adults with higher exposure to air pollution made 50% more errors on mental exams in comparison than those with lower exposure. Finally, a 2018 paper found that air pollution worsens performance on verbal and math tests, and that these changes become more pronounced with aging. Air pollution has also been linked to the development of brain inflammation and accumulation of certain proteins in the brain that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. In order to reduce our exposure to air pollution, One precaution is simply to avoid going outdoors if levels of air pollution are particularly elevated. If your exposure to pollution is more regular, then you might want to consider wearing a mask for protection. In addition to avoiding air pollution, we also should do our very best to avoid the use of artificial sweeteners. Artificial sweeteners have been heavily marketed as an alternative to sugar, giving many people the impression that these are actually healthy options. Unfortunately, the evidence suggests quite the opposite. The idea is both untrue and potentially dangerous. It's become increasingly clear that despite the opposite claims, artificial sweeteners have been shown to actually associate with increased risk for weight gain and even type 2 diabetes. And this actually may well be the result of damaging effects of artificial sweeteners on the microbiome. Artificial sweeteners have been repeatedly shown to change how our gut bacteria function, altering the balance and action of our microbes. Beyond just weight gain, this effect on the microbiome may also explain why these so-called zero-calorie sweeteners are linked to increasing risks of developing, as mentioned, type 2 diabetes, a powerful risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. With all these ideas in mind, artificial sweeteners are certainly not doing your brain any favors and should be considered environmental toxins. There's so much emphasis these days on reducing sugar consumption, and it looks like people are drinking a lot of artificially sweetened beverages. Why might that be a bad choice?
Well, if you listen to the food industry, there's no harm from artificially sweetened beverages. In fact, about 100% of their studies show it's harmless, whereas almost 100% of the studies done by independent researchers show it's harmful. And I think we still are learning about what it does, but it can alter the microbiome in your gut, which can cause inflammation and insulin resistance and prediabetes or diabetes. It has certain things in it that can affect your brain. For example, aspartame is an amino acid derivative that can be an excitotoxin for the brain that can overstimulate the brain. We know, for example, many of my patients, for example, have migraines. When they stop their diet sodas, they go away. So we know that we shouldn't be consuming a lot of artificial sweeteners, that there's no benefit to it in terms of weight loss, in terms of reversing diabetes, and there may be significant harm.
Artificial sweeteners have been several studies in high-profile journals by excellent labs around the world, particularly from Israel. So many of the artificial sweeteners are not absorbed in the small intestine. So they're molecules that activate our sweet taste receptors. That's why we take them, so we want to get the sweet taste. But then they're not absorbed, which means they go down to the colon, to the microbes. The microbes handle them just like any other chemical that they get. They break them down. And what's been found is it has profound effects on the relative abundances of good and bad microbes. And one effect is that it leads to an increase in short-chain fatty acid-producing microbes in some parts of the colon, which are then reabsorbed, and there's an additional energy harvest. So you think you're actually taking less or fewer calories, but in reality these calories are just salvaged by a microbiome that is now specialized in salvaging everything that comes down from the top. So instead of the body getting the calories from the sugar up in the small intestine, now the calories come from the colon. But it also has been shown to change the mucus layer, the permeability, the leakiness. And these studies, it's kind of an exception, have really been confirmed in humans. The intake of artificial sweeteners can make diabetes worse, blood sugar control worse than if you eat the same amount of sugar, which is kind of remarkable. We don't know if every artificial sweetener behaves the same way. This has been done now for 3 or 4. I wouldn't say every artificial sweetener has that negative effect, but the ones that have been studied, the most common ones, clearly have become almost like a toxin for our microbes and for our GI tract. The evidence from studies evaluating the negative health effects of artificial sweeteners, of those artificial sweeteners that have been studied, it's pretty clear, the evidence, both from mouse studies and from human studies, that they can be considered harmful. I could even say some kind of a toxin to the human host.
So we now understand that toxins such as glyphosate and artificial sweeteners harm the microbiome. Damage to the microbiome is linked with increased inflammation, a cornerstone mechanism in Alzheimer's disease. While damage to the microbiome through exposure to toxins indirectly increases inflammation in the brain, certain toxic substances can also directly increase inflammation in the brain. This is because when the immune cells in the brain are exposed to toxins, they start a cycle of inflammation. We've mentioned the damaging effects of inflammation on the brain throughout this documentary, but let's take a moment to see exactly how this all ties together. Just like the rest of the body, the brain is strongly connected to the immune system. Let's just get technical for a moment. In the brain, one of the most important parts of the immune system are what are called the microglial cells. The microglia are immune cells that help to monitor the environment within the brain and perform a variety of functions. But here's the key. When the brain is inflamed, the microglia appear to change in a way that worsens the inflammation. In addition, when conditions are unhealthy, the microglial cells themselves may start a cycle of inflammation within the brain. And one of the things that might lead to this damaging state in which microglia create inflammation is when they are exposed to environmental toxins. Another way that toxins harm our brains is through disrupting our hormones. Hormones are immeasurably important when it comes to our body's overall health as well as functionality. You can think of hormones as chemical messenger molecules that travel throughout the body and play a variety of different roles, helping our cells and organs do their work. If hormones become imbalanced, this can cause a cascade of downstream effects, including weight gain, mood problems, fatigue, sleep problems, and many, many more. And, as you might have guessed, hormone dysregulation is also linked to Alzheimer's disease. Our brains are deeply dependent on healthy hormone signaling for healthy functioning. And when these hormones are altered, problems are quick to show up. So let's see how common environmental toxins like BPA can disrupt our hormones.
We definitely know that there's a strong link between being exposed to environmental toxins and your hormone balance. So I'll give you a few examples. Bisphenol A is one of the most common environmental toxins. You get exposed to it through eating canned food, through plastic bottles, and even the non-BPA plastic often can expose you to similar compounds. So what does BPA do in terms of your hormones? It is an estrogen disruptor. It's an androgen disruptor, so it disrupts your DHEA and also your testosterone. And it also is an insulin disruptor. So another term for that is an obesogen. Now, what we know is that certain environmental toxins, especially heavy metals come to mind, but BPA also, can lead to problems in the brain as well. And so is this a direct effect? Is it through the hormonal response? Is it through the gut-brain axis? I don't know that the details are so well defined, but in some ways that doesn't matter as much as knowing that these exposures increase your risk.
There are compounds like BPA found in plastic that is a known xenoestrogen. So it's an estrogen that is not produced by a living person, but comes from the outside and not in a good way. And these xenoestrogens are known neuroendocrine disruptors, which means they mess up your brain and your hormones. And they have been associated with an increased risk of cancer in women and also with a very precocious puberty in girls and also with medical conditions like man boobs. So basically they really disrupt your hormones, but the point is that they also disrupt your brain. So anything that is toxic in your body increases inflammation, and inflammation is really bad for your brain as well. And if your hormones are not functioning correctly, then your brain is also really strongly affected.
Now, if you read the labels on a lot of processed foods and meats, you may have noticed the words nitrates or nitrites. These are the types of food additives that lead to the formation of damaging nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are toxins that have been shown to cause insulin resistance. And as we found out in episode 5 on diabetes, insulin resistance is directly linked to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease.
There's also evidence that nitrosamines cause insulin resistance, and so I'm a big fan of completely avoiding any exposure that's possible, and that there's a whole list of things that have it, including some beers. So you want to make sure that you're not getting those exposures, because over the long term, they will contribute to insulin resistance diseases. Usually, if you're looking at a package, it'll say nitrates and nitrites 2%. And sometimes they'll say nitrates and nitrites none added. I don't know what that means, because it means that they didn't add it, but it was there beforehand. So basically, reading the package to know if any has been added. But the safer way is to simply go after, if you can, organic meats and things like that. And just looking at products that you know don't have any nitrosamines. Basically, they're caused by the fact that you add nitrates and nitrites as preservatives, as color modifiers. Most of the processed meats have it, or many of them do. I have to say that over the last several years, I've noticed that manufacturers seem to be taking them out, and they're putting big labels on it saying that they've done that. So that's a good thing. Reading the labels is what really matters.
Finally, I think it's really important that we take a look at a specific over-the-counter medication, a type called a proton pump inhibitor, or acid-blocking drug. These drugs are incredibly common and are used to treat heartburn by blocking stomach acid. To be sure, these drugs are not a free ride, and they can wreak havoc on your brain, specifically by disrupting the delicate balance of bacteria in your gut. We learned a great deal about how important these bacteria are in episode 7. Now we'll explore even more deeply the relationship between acid-blocking drugs, disruption of the microbiome, and potential risk for Alzheimer's disease.
I've had a campaign against acid-blocking drugs for 25 years. They are among the most widely used drugs in the Western world. That's because a lot of people have heartburn, and the main reason they have heartburn is they're eating too much or they're eating too quickly. They're not slowing down to eat and enjoy their food. Heartburn is not due to too much acid. It's due to the enzymes that are found in the stomach getting up to tissues above the stomach that are very sensitive to the pain that those enzymes produce. The enzymes require acid for their activity, so these acid-blocking drugs are used to relieve the symptoms, and they may or may not work. The problem with those drugs is that you need stomach acid, and by using acid-blocking drugs to prevent the symptoms of heartburn, you're not really dealing with the true cause of heartburn, which is the reflux of stomach enzymes up into the esophagus. That's where the problem lies. So what you really need to do is to tighten the valve that keeps stomach contents in the stomach and prevents them from rising up into the esophagus. Well, when you start to suppress acid secretion, that does several things. One of the things is it allows an overgrowth of bacteria in the stomach and in the upper parts of the small intestine. So you start getting bacterial overgrowth there, you're going to get a lot of metabolic activity by these bacteria that your body is not prepared to handle. There will be toxic substances produced. There may be symptoms like gas and bloating. These acid-suppressing drugs also interfere with the digestion of protein, which makes protein much more allergenic. And so people who have food allergies have a dramatic increase in the level of allergic antibodies to those foods when they start taking the acid suppressors. I've created a whole protocol for helping people get off their reliance of acid suppressing drugs. I use it in my practice frequently. I have described it in 2 books that I've published. One is a Kindle ebook called The Heartburn and Indigestion Solution, and the other is a book on the reversal of the allergy epidemic called The Allergy Solution, which was co-written with my son Jonathan. So these protocols are out there. They're easy to follow. They have helped at least 90% of the people that I've treated get off their reliance on acid-suppressing drugs.
PPIs are way overprescribed. They're given for any complaint, any gastrointestinal complaint that people have, or bought over the counter. And I think we are, just like we do with other medical interventions, we're dealing with a system, we're harming a system that we don't even completely understand. I would say caution when taking PPIs, unless there's really a true medical indication such as severe acid reflux or ulcer disease or...
We absolutely cannot avoid the idea that environmental exposures are threatening to the brain. Take a moment to consider your lifestyle. Are you eating a lot of GMO foods that may contain glyphosate? Do you consume artificial sweeteners with the mistaken belief that it's actually better than sugar? Both are threatening. Are you currently taking acid-blocking drugs? Are you regularly exposed to air pollution? All of these things can contribute to Alzheimer's disease risk. I hope that you're realizing how important this subject is for your health, both today and certainly in the future. There are many practical steps you can take to reduce your toxin exposure. Avoiding environmental toxins is one of the tools that you have in your toolkit to prevent Alzheimer's disease. So let's review some steps you can implement right now to reduce your exposure to environmental toxins.
I would say when it comes to the gut-brain axis, the number one most important influence is food. Organic food is essential. You want to make sure that you're eating food that's super nourishing for you, that's filling in all those nutrient gaps that you have, and that doesn't have these other party crashers coming along for the ride, like pesticides, herbicides, things like glyphosate, which can disrupt the gut-brain barrier and lead to neuroinflammation, lead to hormonal disruption. When it comes to organic foods, one of the issues is that it's not always possible to get organic food. So I travel a lot, for instance, and sometimes I'm just stuck at the airport and I've already run out of the food that I brought with me in my suitcase. And so in the best of all worlds, we would all be able to eat organic, but what we know in the US, for instance, is that 99% of farmland is not organic. So it can be difficult, it can sometimes be more expensive to eat organic food. And so what we need to do is the best that we can. Reduce exposure whenever possible. So use organic skin products, drink filtered water from a stainless steel container, cook in pans that are stainless steel or don't have plastic coatings. And the second opportunity is to detoxify. So to test yourself, to see, are you exposed to environmental toxins? Do you have a heavy metal load in your body that's potentially affecting your brain and acting as a dementigen? And so we have to detoxify. We have to know and test and also detoxify.
It's really important as much as possible to be mindful of what you put in your body, and anything from just the foods you eat to the place where you live, because pesticide contamination is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, especially in people with a genetic predisposition.
If toxins are so important in terms of the brain and its health, what can people do to either identify or, more importantly, offload some of those toxins?
Well, there's two strategies. One is, in order to remove toxins from your life, you have to identify the sources. And there's a great website, ewg.org, an environmental working group, that has done deep research on what exists, where the exposures are, and how to minimize them. So you can learn what skincare products you can use that don't have lead in them or parabens. You can learn which household products don't have toxins in them that you use to clean your house. Which foods to eat, for example, which vegetables have the least pesticides and have the most, which meats and fish to eat that are safer for you, and on and on. So we have great guides on how to reduce your exposure. At the same time, you have to upregulate or increase your body's capacity to get rid of these. And there are clear strategies to do this. Food is number one. One, get rid of the worst toxin, which is sugar. But then you have to increase certain foods that have phytochemicals, which are these plant compounds that work with your body to do good things, that help detoxification, for example, like broccoli or collards or kale, that whole family of brassicas, garlic and onions, green tea, pomegranate. These all have powerful detoxifying properties that you can use to your advantage by eating these foods. So eating a diet rich in polyphenols and antioxidants, plant-rich diet, and certain specific vegetables can help. And also making sure you're pooping and peeing regularly, which many people don't. Your urine should be clear. It shouldn't be dark yellow. You should be going to the bathroom once or twice a day. I had a patient, I once said to her, "So are you regular?" She goes, "Yeah, I'm regular." I said, "How often do you go?" She says, "I go once a week." I said, "That's not regular." She says, "Regular for me, I go every week." And I think we don't understand the importance of eliminating waste. So pooping, peeing, sweating, these are really key strategies for helping remove toxins. And then, of course, there are supplements you can take to help upregulate pathways like glutathione, for example, N-acetylcysteine, or milk thistle, or selenium, or zinc, or lipoic acid that all help to upregulate the body's capacity to detoxify. And including those as part of your regimen can be very helpful.
We are so grateful to our guest speakers for sharing their incredible knowledge with us about environmental exposures. We've learned that decreasing our exposure to environmental toxins is absolutely essential for brain health. And here are some actionable steps you can take today to help you avoid toxins. Eat organic. Choose non-GMO foods. The reason we want to avoid genetically modified foods is because, by and large, foods that are genetically modified are foods that are sprayed with glyphosate. It's the glyphosate that's the toxin. Pay attention to air quality reports if you live in an area exposed to air pollution. Avoid consuming artificial sweeteners. Read your food labels to avoid consuming nitrates or nitrites. Try to avoid eating out of or drinking out of plastics whenever possible, or use BPA-free plastics. Use cooking pans with stainless steel components instead of plastic coatings. Now that you know the damaging effects upon the microbiome of acid-blocking drugs, ask your health provider if a drug like that is really in your interest. These simple but powerfully effective steps will help you decrease your exposure to potentially damaging environmental toxins. Remember, every step you can take to help lower the risk of Alzheimer's is important. As it relates to toxins, making positive changes can be as simple as switching from a plastic to a metal water container, or reading the ingredient list on food and selecting products without nitrates. Every little bit counts. Alzheimer's, the science of prevention, is all about empowerment. Each and every one of you has the ability to improve your brain function at any age by incorporating the information we cover in this series into your daily life. This cutting-edge information isn't available anywhere else, and that's why owning all of the expert interviews, the transcripts, and the supporting materials is so incredibly valuable. I highly recommend making Alzheimer's, the Science of Prevention, along with the bonus materials, part of your family library. By making some simple lifestyle changes, you can evoke lasting improvements in your health and in your life. These changes may not only help prevent Alzheimer's, they will almost certainly improve cognitive function for you right now. You might notice that you start thinking more clearly, forgetting less, and generally feeling better throughout the day. Sometimes, the hardest part in taking action and making these lifestyle changes is figuring out where to start. With that in mind, the bonus materials include resources that will help you apply this knowledge to your life one step at a time. We interviewed over 20 leaders in the field of brain health and Alzheimer's disease and received some fantastic actionable information from each of our experts. Unfortunately, we were not able to include all of that information in this series, and that's why the bonus materials also include the full-length interviews from all